At 0547 hours on December 16, 1944, Private First Class Eugene Garrett stood in a foxhole near Echternach, Luxembourg, watching fog roll through the Ardennes forest like something alive. Garrett was 22 years old, from Kansas, and he had been in combat for exactly 11 days. His rifle was frozen, his boots were soaking wet, and in approximately 90 seconds he was going to witness something that would convince him the United States Army was about to lose the war in Europe. Garrett heard it before he saw it. A sound like distant thunder, except thunder does not maintain a steady rhythm. Artillery. Not the occasional harassing fire the Germans had been lobbing at American positions for weeks. This was different. This was every gun the Wehrmacht owned firing at the same time. Garrett counted to 10 before the first shells started landing. The ground shook. Trees exploded into splinters. Men screamed. And through the smoke and snow and chaos, Garrett saw them. German soldiers. Hundreds of them. Advancing in formation through the fog like ghosts in field gray uniforms. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, but what Garrett did not know, what almost no one in the American military knew at that moment, was that Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had been warned this was coming. Not vaguely. Not with hints or speculation. He had been given specific intelligence 72 hours earlier that indicated a massive German offensive was imminent in the Ardennes sector. Intelligence that identified troop concentrations, armor movements, supply stockpiles. Intelligence that should have triggered an immediate redeployment of American forces to reinforce the weakest point in the Allied line. Eisenhower had read the reports. He had discussed them with his intelligence staff, and then he had made a decision that would condemn thousands of American soldiers to death or capture in the frozen forests of Belgium. He ignored the warning. Not because he doubted the intelligence, not because he lacked the resources to respond, but because of something else. Something that would remain classified for decades. Something that involved the 101st Airborne Division and a secret struggle that had nothing to do with fighting Germans. If you want to understand why one of the greatest military minds in American history made a decision that nearly cost the Allies the war, hit that like button right now. This story has been buried in classified files and personal letters for 80 years. Every like helps us share forgotten history with more people. And if you have not subscribed, do it now. We are rescuing these stories every single day. Back to December 1944 and the warning Eisenhower chose to ignore. The Ardennes sector in December 1944 was considered a quiet zone. The forest was dense, the roads were poor, and Allied intelligence had assessed the terrain as unsuitable for large-scale German offensive operations. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from the United States with minimal combat experience, held 27 miles of front line with approximately 15,000 men. That is nearly double the frontage military doctrine recommended for a single division. The 106th was spread thin, undermanned, and vulnerable. But Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the command structure Eisenhower led, had made a calculated decision. The Ardennes was where you put divisions that needed rest or divisions that needed experience before being committed to major operations. The real fighting was happening to the north, where British and Canadian forces were pushing toward the Rhine, and to the south, where General George Patton's Third Army was driving toward the Saar. The Ardennes was a backwater, a place where nothing important happened, except German High Command had been planning something important for months. Operation Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. The objective was audacious to the point of insanity. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, supported by 1,400 tanks and assault guns, would smash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. British forces would be cut off in the north. American forces would be isolated in the south. the Allies would be forced to negotiate a separate peace with Germany, allowing Hitler to concentrate all German military power against the Soviet Union in the East. It was a desperate plan, a plan born from desperation. But it was not impossible. And American intelligence knew something was happening. By early December 1944, Allied reconnaissance units were reporting unusual German activity in the Eifel region east of the Ardennes. Radio intercepts indicated troop movements. Aerial reconnaissance photographed new supply dumps being established near the front lines. Captured German soldiers were talking about a coming offensive. None of this information was conclusive on its own, but when assembled together, it painted a picture. The Germans were preparing for something big. On December 13th, 3 days before the offensive began, a report landed on Eisenhower's desk at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles. The report came from Colonel Benjamin Dickson, intelligence officer for the 1st United States Army. Dickson had been tracking German movements for weeks, and his conclusion was unambiguous. The enemy was preparing a major attack in the Ardennes sector, likely within the next 72 to 96 hours. Dickson estimated German strength at between 6 and 8 divisions, possibly more. He recommended immediate reinforcement of the 106th Infantry Division and the deployment of additional armored reserves to positions where they could respond quickly to a breakthrough. The report was detailed. It was specific, and it was correct. Eisenhower read the report during a staff meeting on the evening of December 13th. Also present were Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief intelligence officer, and Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. The three men discussed Dickson's conclusions for approximately 45 minutes. Strong acknowledged that German activity in the Ardennes was abnormal, but he argued the buildup could be defensive in nature. The Germans knew the Allies were planning offensives to the north and south. Concentrating forces in the center made strategic sense if the goal was to prevent an Allied breakthrough. Smith was more concerned. He suggested pulling the 82nd Airborne Division out of rest status and positioning them near the Ardennes as a precautionary measure. The 82nd was one of the most experienced units in the European theater. If the Germans did attack, the paratroopers could respond quickly. Eisenhower considered the recommendation. And then he said no. Not because he believed Dickson was wrong, not because he thought the Germans incapable of launching an offensive, but because of the 101st Airborne Division. The Screaming Eagles, the other elite airborne unit in the theater. And the reason Eisenhower could not redeploy the 82nd was directly connected to what was happening with the 101st. A problem that had been festering for months, a problem that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness and everything to do with politics, ego, and a brewing crisis that threatened to tear apart the airborne forces at the worst possible moment. The 101st Airborne Division had been pulled off the line in November 1944 after 2 months of continuous combat in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. The division had suffered heavy casualties. Over 2,100 men killed, wounded, or missing. Morale was strained, equipment was worn out. The plan was to send the 101st to a rest area near Reims, France, where the division could refit, absorb replacements, and recover before being committed to combat again. But something had gone wrong during the rest period. Something involving the division's commanding officer, Major General Maxwell Taylor. Taylor had left the 101st on December 7th to attend a conference in Washington. He would be gone for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Command of the division had passed to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander. McAuliffe was experienced and competent, but he was not Maxwell Taylor. And Taylor's absence had triggered a crisis within the airborne command structure, because the 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st's rival, was commanded by Major General James Gavin. Gavin was younger than Taylor, more aggressive, and he had been angling for months to have the 82nd recognized as the premier airborne division in the European theater. With Taylor gone, Gavin saw an opportunity. He began lobbying Eisenhower's staff to have the 82nd designated as the primary airborne reserve, the unit that would receive priority for equipment, replacements, and mission assignments. If the 82nd became the primary reserve, the 101st would be relegated to secondary status. Taylor would return from Washington to find his division marginalized. McAuliffe knew what Gavin was doing, and he had been fighting a bureaucratic war for the past week to prevent it. He needed to keep the 101st visible, relevant, and ready for deployment. But the division was not ready. Replacements had not been fully integrated. Training exercises had been delayed. Equipment shortages had not been resolved. If Eisenhower called on the 101st for an emergency deployment, McAuliffe was not certain the division could respond effectively. And if the 101st responded poorly, Gavin would use it as evidence that the division should be downgraded. The rivalry between the two airborne divisions had always existed, but Taylor's absence had turned competition into open conflict. Eisenhower was aware of the situation. He had received complaints from both Gavin and McAuliffe. He had been forced to mediate arguments between their respective staffs over resource allocation. And he was tired of it. The Supreme Commander had more important concerns than managing the egos of two airborne generals. But the problem had created a constraint. If Eisenhower deployed the 82nd to the Ardennes as a precautionary measure based on Dickson's intelligence report, he would be signaling that the 82nd was the primary reserve. McAuliffe would interpret it as a loss of confidence in the 101st. Taylor would return from Washington furious. The airborne rivalry would escalate. And Eisenhower needed both divisions functional and cohesive for the planned offensives in early 1945. So Eisenhower made a calculated decision. He would not redeploy the 82nd. He would not reinforce the Ardennes. He would accept the risk that Dickson's intelligence might be correct, because the alternative, triggering a full-blown crisis within the airborne forces, seemed more damaging in the long term. Eisenhower believed the Germans lacked the fuel and ammunition for a sustained offensive. Even if they attacked, they could not advance far. American forces would contain the breakthrough, counterattack, and destroy the German spearheads. It would be costly, but manageable. What Eisenhower did not anticipate was how fast the German attack would succeed, or how close the Wehrmacht would come to achieving their objective. At 0530 hours on December 16th, German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. Over 1,600 guns fired simultaneously. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. American positions were obliterated. Communication lines were severed. Command posts were destroyed. When the artillery lifted, 3 German armies began to advance. In the northern sector, the 6th Panzer Army attacked toward Liege. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army drove toward the Meuse River crossings. In the south, the 7th Army moved to block American reinforcements. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. American units that had been expecting a quiet day found themselves fighting for survival against overwhelming force. The 106th Infantry Division disintegrated within 48 hours. 2 entire regiments, over 8,000 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender on December 19th. It was the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. German armored spearheads penetrated 50 miles into Allied-held territory. Fuel dumps were overrun. Supply depots were captured. Entire battalions were cut off and destroyed. Panic spread through the rear areas as rumors circulated that German paratroopers had landed behind American lines and that SS commandos, disguised in American uniforms, were sabotaging communications and assassinating officers. Some of these rumors were true. Otto Skorzeny, the SS officer who had rescued Mussolini in 1943, was leading a special operation called Greif. English-speaking German soldiers wearing American uniforms were operating behind Allied lines, changing road signs, cutting telephone wires, and spreading disinformation. Eisenhower first learned of the German offensive at 0830 hours on December 16th, when 1st Army Headquarters reported heavy enemy contact across the entire Ardennes front. Initial reports were confused and incomplete. It took until midday for the scale of the attack to become clear. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting of his senior commanders at Verdun on December 19th. Present were Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, General George Patton, commander of the 3rd Army, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commander of the 1st Army, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group. Eisenhower opened the meeting by acknowledging the situation was serious but not catastrophic. The German offensive was a gamble. If the Allies responded aggressively, they could turn the German attack into a decisive Allied victory by encircling and destroying the attackers. Patton had already anticipated this. He had quietly begun repositioning 3rd Army units northward 2 days earlier without waiting for orders. Patton told Eisenhower he could have 3 divisions attacking north into the German flank within 48 hours. Eisenhower approved. But 3 divisions would not be enough to stop the German advance. The critical point was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. Bastogne sat at the intersection of 7 roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. If the Germans captured Bastogne, their armored spearheads could continue west toward the Meuse River. If the Americans held Bastogne, the German advance would stall. Eisenhower needed a division in Bastogne immediately, a division that could move fast, dig in, and hold against overwhelming odds. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were the only units available. Both divisions were still in rest areas in France. Both could be loaded onto trucks and moved to Belgium within 24 hours. Eisenhower had to choose. The decision should have been simple. Deploy both divisions. Send the 82nd to the northern shoulder of the Bulge to reinforce the defensive line. Send the 101st to Bastogne to hold the road junction. But the rivalry between the 2 divisions had created a problem. If Eisenhower sent the 82nd north and the 101st to Bastogne, Gavin would argue his division had been given the less critical mission. If Eisenhower sent the 101st north and the 82nd to Bastogne, McAuliffe would argue the same. Whichever division got Bastogne would be in the most dangerous position, surrounded and outnumbered, but also in the most visible position. The division that held Bastogne would become legendary. The division that did not would be forgotten. Eisenhower understood the politics. And he made a decision that prioritized operational necessity over ego management. He sent the 101st to Bastogne because the 101st was already closer. The division was at Moormelon, approximately 100 miles from Bastogne. The 82nd was at Sisson, slightly farther away. Logistics dictated the choice. But Eisenhower also made another decision. He sent the 82nd to the northern shoulder of the Bulge, to a sector where the fighting would be just as intense, just as critical, but far less visible. The 82nd would fight in the forests and small villages around Wehrmacht and Trois-Ponts. They would stop the 1st SS Panzer Division. They would prevent the German breakthrough in the north. But they would do it without the world watching. The 101st Airborne Division received movement orders at 20:30 hours on December 17th. Brigadier General McAuliffe was told to move his division to Bastogne and hold the town until relieved. No specific timeline was provided for relief. McAuliffe understood what that meant. The 101st was being sent into a situation where relief might not come at all. The division had approximately 11,000 men. German intelligence estimated at least 45,000 German troops were converging on Bastogne from 3 directions. The odds were 4-1 against. McAuliffe asked how long he was expected to hold. The answer was vague, as long as necessary. The 101st began moving at midnight on December 17th. Over 380 trucks carried the division north through freezing rain and snow. The roads were clogged with refugees fleeing west and American units retreating in disorder. Military police had to clear the roads to allow the 101st to move forward. Soldiers in the retreating units shouted warnings at the paratroopers. "They're coming. You're going the wrong way. Get out while you can." The men of the 101st ignored them. By dawn on December 18th, the lead elements of the division reached Bastogne. McAuliffe established his command post in a Belgian army barracks on the southern edge of town. He deployed his regiments in a circular defensive perimeter around Bastogne, with artillery positioned in the center to provide fire support in all directions. The 101st had arrived just in time. German advance units were already probing the outskirts of the town. The Siege of Bastogne began on December 19th. German forces surrounded the town and cut all roads leading in or out. The 101st was now isolated. No reinforcements could reach them. Supplies could only be delivered by air, and the weather was too bad for aerial resupply. Fog, snow, and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. The paratroopers had the ammunition and food they had brought with them, and that was it. Medical supplies ran out within 3 days. Morphine was reserved for the most severe cases. Surgeons operated without anesthesia. Wounded men died from infections that antibiotics could have prevented. The cold was relentless. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit at night. Soldiers in foxholes suffered frostbite. Some lost fingers and toes. Some froze to death in their positions. German forces attacked Bastogne from all directions. Panzer divisions tried to punch through the American perimeter with armored assaults. Infantry divisions probed for weak points. Artillery bombarded the town day and night. The 101st held. But the cost was severe. Casualties mounted. By December 22nd, the division had lost over 1,200 men killed, wounded, or missing. Ammunition was running low. Some units were down to fewer than 10 rounds per man. McAuliffe knew the situation was unsustainable. If the weather did not clear soon, if aerial resupply did not begin, the 101st would be forced to surrender. On the morning of December 22nd, German commanders sent a delegation under a white flag to McAuliffe's command post. The Germans delivered a formal surrender demand. The message stated that Bastogne was surrounded, that further resistance was futile, and that the American commander had 2 hours to accept honorable surrender terms. If McAuliffe refused, the German forces would annihilate the defenders. McAuliffe read the message, looked at his staff officers, and said one word: nuts. His operations officer suggested that the Germans might not understand American slang. McAuliffe wrote out a formal reply. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. The German delegation was dismissed. The siege continued. But what the men of the 101st did not know was that Eisenhower was facing a different crisis at Supreme Headquarters. Montgomery had been placed in temporary command of all American forces north of the Bulge, including the 1st and 9th Armies. This decision had been made for operational reasons. Communication between Bradley's headquarters and the Northern forces had been severed by the German advance. Montgomery was better positioned to coordinate the defense. But the decision had triggered a political firestorm. American generals were furious that a British officer had been given command of American troops. Bradley threatened to resign. Patton called Montgomery a tired little fart and suggested the British were using the crisis to seize control of the American command structure. Eisenhower had to manage the politics while simultaneously managing the battle, and Montgomery was making things worse. Instead of launching an immediate counterattack to relieve Bastogne, Montgomery insisted on consolidating defensive lines and building up reserves for a methodical offensive. Montgomery believed the Germans were overextended and would collapse on their own once they ran out of fuel and ammunition. He saw no reason to risk a hasty counterattack. Eisenhower disagreed. Every day Bastogne remained surrounded. The 101st lost men and supplies. If the division was forced to surrender, the psychological impact would be catastrophic. American morale would collapse. German morale would soar. The political consequences in Washington would be severe. Eisenhower needed Bastogne relieved immediately. Patton's Third Army was attacking north toward Bastogne, but progress was slow. German resistance was fierce. Roads were blocked by destroyed vehicles and blown bridges. Snow and ice slowed movement. Patton's lead division, the 4th Armored, was still 15 miles south of Bastogne on December 23rd. McAuliffe radioed that the 101st could hold for another 48 hours, maybe 72 if aerial resupply resumed. If relief did not arrive by December 26th, the division would run out of ammunition and be forced to surrender. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. Allied aircraft filled the skies over Bastogne. C-47 transport planes dropped supplies by parachute. Fighter bombers attacked German positions around the perimeter. The men of the 101st watched the planes with something close to religious reverence. They had been abandoned, left to die in a frozen town in Belgium. And now the sky was full of American aircraft. Supplies poured in. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, winter clothing. It was not enough to end the siege, but it was enough to keep fighting. Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through German lines south of Bastogne on the afternoon of December 26th. Lead tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion reached the American perimeter at 16:45 hours. The siege of Bastogne was over. The 101st Airborne had held for 8 days against overwhelming odds. The division had lost over 2,000 men, but they had not surrendered. Bastogne remained in American hands. The German offensive had failed. But the story did not end there, because in the weeks and months after Bastogne, the rivalry between the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions exploded. The 101st became famous. Newspapers called them the battered bastards of Bastogne. McAuliffe's reply of nuts became legendary. The division received a Presidential Unit citation. Hollywood made movies about Bastogne. The 101st was celebrated as the division that had saved the Ardennes. And the 82nd Airborne, which had fought just as hard in the northern sector, which had stopped the 1st SS Panzer Division at Trois Ponts, which had prevented the German breakthrough toward Lille, received almost no recognition. Gavin was furious. He wrote letters to Eisenhower's staff arguing that the 82nd's contribution had been ignored. He demanded equal recognition. Taylor, who had returned from Washington in late December, was equally furious, but for different reasons. He had missed the defining moment of his division's history. McAuliffe had commanded at Bastogne. McAuliffe had given the famous reply. McAuliffe was being celebrated while Taylor had been in Washington attending conferences. Taylor began a quiet campaign to marginalize McAuliffe within the division. He reassigned McAuliffe to a staff position and took direct command of combat operations. The tension between Taylor and McAuliffe simmered for months. Eisenhower later admitted in private letters that his decision to ignore the intelligence warning before the Battle of the Bulge had been a mistake. He had underestimated German capabilities and overestimated American readiness. But he never publicly acknowledged the role the airborne rivalry had played in his decision-making. The official history of the Battle of the Bulge does not mention the 82nd versus 101st tensions. It does not mention Gavin's lobbying, or McAuliffe's concerns, or Taylor's absence. Those details remained buried in personal papers and classified documents for decades. What is known now, based on declassified files and interviews with surviving officers, is that Eisenhower faced an impossible choice in December 1944. Deploy the 82nd to the Ardennes based on intelligence that might be wrong and trigger a crisis within the airborne forces, or accept the risk and hope the Germans could be contained. Eisenhower chose the second option. He gambled. And thousands of American soldiers paid the price. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States Army over 89,000 casualties, 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest single battle American forces fought in World War II. German losses were even higher, over 100,000 casualties and the destruction of their last strategic reserve. The battle delayed the Allied advance into Germany by 6 weeks, but it did not change the outcome of the war. Germany was finished. The only question was how long it would take. Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience and determination. The 101st Airborne became legendary. But the soldiers who fought there knew the truth. They had been sent into Bastogne not because it was strategically necessary, though it was. They had been sent because of politics, because of rivalry, because Eisenhower needed to manage egos as much as he needed to manage armies. The men in the foxholes did not care about airborne rivalries, they cared about survival. And they survived because they had no other choice. McAuliffe never received the recognition he deserved. He was promoted to Major General after the war, but he never commanded a division in combat again. Taylor went on to become Army Chief of Staff and later Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Gavin became a Lieutenant General and commanded the 7th Army in post-war Germany. The rivalry between the 82nd and 101st continued for decades through Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. It continues today. Both divisions claim to be the best airborne unit in the United States Army. Both have earned that claim through blood and sacrifice. Eisenhower died in 1969. In his final years, he was asked repeatedly about the Battle of the Bulge and whether he had made mistakes. He acknowledged tactical errors and intelligence failures. But he never discussed the airborne rivalry. He never explained why he ignored Dickson's warning on December 13th. That secret remained buried with him. The soldiers who fought at Bastogne are almost all gone now. Eugene Garrett, the private who watched the German offensive begin on December 16th, survived the war. He returned to Kansas, married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about Bastogne. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, a local newspaper interviewed him. They asked what he remembered most about Bastogne. Garrett said he remembered the cold. He remembered the fear. And he remembered wondering why no one had seen it coming. Why the Army had been caught by surprise. Why they had been sent to Bastogne at the last possible moment instead of being deployed earlier when they might have stopped the Germans before the breakthrough. Garrett never got an answer. He died in 2003 at the age of 81. The warning Eisenhower ignored was real. The intelligence was accurate. The decision to disregard it was made for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity. And the men who paid the price never knew why. They fought because they were ordered to fight. They held because they had no choice. And they became legends not because of strategy or planning or leadership, but because they refused to surrender when surrender was the logical option. That is the story of Bastogne, not the Hollywood version. Not the sanitized history taught in military academies. The real story. The story of rivalry and ego in politics and the men who suffered because of decisions made in headquarters far from the front lines. If this story moved you, if it changed how you understand the Battle of the Bulge, hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear the truth. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Belgium? Our community spans the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served at Bastogne. Just let us know you are here. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we are rescuing forgotten stories like this every single day. Stories about soldiers who deserve to be remembered for who they really were, not who history pretended they were. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure the men of Bastogne are not forgotten. They earned that much. And we owe them the truth.